Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're watching my video from. My name is Obioma Obioma, and I am a PhD candidate at the Social Psychology Department of Goethe University. Today, I'm going to be presenting our study on men and women's stereotypic characterizations, and we compared these characterizations between Germans and Nigerians. The study was carried out by myself, Tanya Henschel, and Alina Hernandez-Bach. So, what are gender stereotypes? We've highlighted three definitions that sort of guide this research. First of all, gender stereotypes are generalizations about attributes of men and women. The second is overgeneralized perceptions about men and women. Now, the keywords here are attributes and perceptions. Now, if you have an attribute or a trait that you ascribe to a man or a woman, it will influence your perception of that man or woman. And as perfectly as Ben put it, these gender stereotypes are not only used to characterize others, so we're not only thinking about others when we think about these gender stereotypes, but we also think about ourselves as well. So I've highlighted a couple of studies that might be interesting for you if you are not so conversant with gender stereotype literature. Okay, so cross-cultural comparisons of gender stereotypes have been quite limited in research. A lot of studies have conducted or have examined gender stereotypes within countries, but when looking cross-culturally, we do not find so many studies. And even when we do find a couple of studies like Abele and Shine 2001, we find that these studies are either focused on European countries or comparing European countries with Asian countries. Now, there is a bit of a gap when it comes to African countries and gender stereotypes related to African countries. Now, Williams and Best is one of the old but gold studies which have examined gender stereotypes in not just European countries or African countries, but also Asian countries all at the same time. So your findings included that Asian and African countries tend to be more traditional in their gender stereotypes. This just means that Asians and Africans tend to have very distinct differences between what they attribute to men and women. So what traits that they think men and women have. And Nigeria was one of the most traditional of all countries. They also found that European countries, which included Germany, had more modern ideologies. This just meant that men and women weren't seen as so separate or so different, but it was sort of a fluid perception or trait description. And they also found that across all the 27 or 30 countries, depending on what version of the book you read, they found that there was sort of a pan-cultural agreement between countries. So usually most countries rated men based on some traits and perceived women to have certain traits as well. But when it came to self-ascription, women tended to also not only focus on having communal traits themselves, but also including agentic traits or more masculine traits in this case. So what was the research gap? We find that there's a lack of comparison between Western and non-Western or global South and global Northern countries. And there's also a sort of inattention to gender stereotyping and self-characterization in non-Western countries, especially in African countries. Three questions came up. Do people hold traditional stereotypes in Germany and Nigeria? So is it more traditional in Nigeria compared to Germany? Are men more typically going to be ascribed more agency and women more communion? And do men even perceive themselves as having more agency and women perceive themselves as having more communion? So we collected data from Germans and Nigerians, and we asked them to either rate themselves, men, or women in general. So this was a between subject design. And we used Tanya and colleagues' multidimensional scale to examine agency and communion. And your agency scale has 4 subdimensions, and the communion scale has 3 subdimensions. So next, we have 403 samples in total. 217 of them are from Germany and 186 from Nigeria. We also had more women in Nigeria, and these Nigerian sample were younger and more educated than in Germany. We looked at, okay, if the sample is slightly younger in Nigeria and slightly more educated, is there going to be a difference if we separate people who are above 40 or who have had a university education compared to the others? And we found no main or interaction effects for age or educational attainment. So next, we looked at the content of gender stereotypes across countries, and then we further went into the data to look at it within countries as well. So first, across countries, we found that men in general were rated higher agency in Nigeria compared to Germany. Now, this is when we look at the overall scale, but when we look at the sub-dimensions of agency, then we find that there's a bit of difference. So on some scales, men are higher in Nigeria, and on other scales, men are higher in Germany. But for women in general, we found a sort of consistent rating that Nigerian women were higher in agency than German women. Now, for communion, the results were sort of reversed. So German men were rated way more communal than Nigerian men, but German women and Nigerian women were sort of rated similarly. So it was only a marginal difference on the overall communion scale, but we also found some differences when we looked at the subdimensions. Now, we also thought to examine the target differences within each country. And within Germany, we found that men and women were rated similarly on overall agency and on most of the agency subdimensions, except for independence. While in Nigeria, we saw that on overall agency, it seemed like men and women were rated equally, but then we find the differences on the subdimensions, with women being more competent and men being more assertive. On communion, it was quite similar in Germany again, with consistent equal rating of men and women, except for emotional sensitivity. But in Nigeria, we find that women were way more communal than men on every single scale. Self-characterizations. We find that in Germany versus Nigeria, Nigerians tend to be higher on agency and higher on communion in just self-ratings compared to Germans. Now, we also looked at rated differences within each country. So are men or women rated to be, are men rated to be more agentic, or are women rated to be more communal? In Germany, we find that on agency, men and women are equally agentic. In Nigeria, they were equally agentic on most of the scales, but for instrumental competence, where women were rated higher. Then we moved on to communal. Once again, German self-ratings were the same for men and the same for women, but in Nigeria, women were again they rated themselves very communal, just like women in general were rated very communal compared to men. So, summary of our results. We found that Nigerian women were rated more agentic than German women. And this could be explained by Nigeria being a very patriarchal society. And according to Wood and Igley, if someone or people in a country with high patriarchy, then agent or agentic traits might be valued and perceived as more positively than communal traits. We also found that German men were more communal than Nigerian men, and Nigerian women were also more communal than German women. And we fall back on the social role theory as to people picking up behaviors and basically traits based on the social role they occupy. So if you look at Germany, we have more female breadwinners, more female politicians, and more women in higher education. So women are starting to take on more agentic roles, you could say. And men are also starting to participate in more housework and household chores. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, you find that women are still seen as subordinate to men and are sort of expected to put your families and homes first before anything else. So this kind of explains why women in Nigeria see themselves as way, way, way more communal than German women see themselves. And while German men also are more communal than Nigerian men. So within each country, we also found some differences. In Germany, there was no difference between men and women, which is in line with Williams and Best 1990, where we just mentioned that men and women had more fluid traits and characterizations. And this is also in line with the World Economic Forum's reports, where gender equality or the gender gap in Germany is way smaller than that of Nigeria. And also in Nigeria, we saw that women rated themselves as more instrumentally competent, and other women were rated higher on leadership and instrumental competence. So a lot of researchers have sort of distinguished between types of competence, or competence and assertiveness. And basically, competence has to do with the ability to get things done. So Nigerian women can get things done, but they do not have the status, or probably because they don't have the status, they don't push to pursue their goals because they feel that there might be so many barriers as well. So that also equals to their low assertiveness. So on self-ratings, we found that 1, Nigerians were more agentic and more communal than Germans, and 2, Nigerian women were just as agentic as Nigerian men, but more communal in their self-ratings. Now, why is this? One could be that women perceive themselves to be more communal than men, which Hensel et al. 2019 found. But this only holds for Nigeria and not necessarily for men, because we found that they were quite equal. And for Williams and Best, we also saw that Nigerian men and women's self-concept tended to be more masculine. And this might also be related to patriarchy, as we mentioned before, while those in Germany were relatively feminine. So what does this mean for us? Women's perception of agency in Nigeria helps them to be a better fit for leadership roles, even though they might not get those roles. Perhaps they embody these traits so that they can have a better chance, if I may say. There is like an equal perception of men and women in Germany. Whether you were looking at agency, communion, it tended to be quite equal between men and women. And this sort of explains the reason why they are ranked so high on the gender equality gap. And finally, we kind of lost some information trying to analyze only overall agency and communion, which is why we really loved the multidimensional scale by Henschel and colleagues, because the sub-dimensions highlighted where information was lost in the overall scale. We would like to highlight the limitations and future directions. So first of all, we had a very highly educated sample, which is known to sort of influence the agency perceptions of individuals. Now, although we tested to see if education had any effect, and it didn't, this is also something that future researchers should think about when you're collecting your samples. Would also put out a call for other researchers to take on gender stereotyping in other countries, especially in countries that have a high immigrant flow. And we would also like to highlight that a lot of these skills are developed for Western countries and industrialized countries, and individuals in developing countries or in African countries might not perceive these items similarly. Lucky for us, this was not much of a problem for our study, but yeah, it's always better to have skills that are developed for specific cultural groups. And this brings us to the end of our presentation. I want to thank you all for being a part of it, and I'm looking forward to your comments, your criticisms, and your suggestions. Thank you, and see you at IACCP 2020+.